FM and WBAI.org on the web. It's 5 p.m. Stay tuned.
I want you to pledge to yourselves in this convention to stand as one solid army against the foes of human labor. Think of the thousands who are killed every year and there is no redress for it. We will fight until the mines are made secure and human life valued more than props. Look things in the face. Don't fear a governor. Don't fear anybody. You pay the governor. He has the right to protect you. You are the biggest part of the population in the state. You create its wealth, so I say, let the fight go on. If nobody else will keep on, I will. Mother Jones, 1913. This is Behind the News, Long Island. It's time.
Check. Hey, yo, it's time. Hey, yo, it's time. It's time. Hey, yo, it's time. We interrupt your programming to bring it to you live from the front lines. Strong animated gangs fleeing one time. Police is brutal like the streets is. Let my speech increase the peace through your speakers. Beat our weakness, of course, is division. Caused by religion, race, poor, be in prison way more than the rich ones. The laws of the pawns for position. My flow expose flaws in the system. Look, you can't afford to be a bystander. Behind the news, where the lies die, we strive for high standards. The real power's in the hands of the people. Politics, propaganda, it's all see-through. And that's word that serves. The time is now. For the youth in our roots, gotta stand our ground. Listen Tuesdays at 5. Tune in to 99.5 East Ways. Reporting live behind the news. Radio will break from the norm as we advocate for change and reform. Behind the news, unifying while exposing the counterfeits. It's the new voice of empowerment. Behind the new platform for the people it serves, where the truth in your speakers emerge. Behind the new, where politics meet their limitations, you get the real, never imitation. Behind the news. It's time, sweet. It's time, it's time. Long Island, what up?
Familia, good evening, family. How's everybody doing? Welcome to another edition of WBAI's Behind the News, Long Island. It's been a couple of months, and I'm not stuttering as much as I used to. I feel a little bit more confident behind this microphone, and tonight we continue building upon the foundation that we've been setting. Talking about issues that no one else wants to talk about, sharing what collective wisdom we all hold in terms of trying to inspire the activist of tomorrow. We're talking about those educators that are sharing that knowledge and wisdom, whether they're in a classroom or out on the streets or even both. Today we have such individuals. Behind the News is that one time during the week from 5 to 6 p.m. where we get together to talk about these issues, and we're in the middle of your dial on 99.5 FM. Radio for the people, by the people, making sure we get the word to the people, right? Tonight we're continuing with our Her Story Month celebration, talking about issues that are impacting women, talking about the history and the legacy of the struggle that our sisters and our daughters and mothers and granddaughters and grandmothers have led, the struggles that they've lived through and survived. And that's pretty much what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about the right of workers, the right of organized labor, and where that all came from and how we got to where we are today. Pretty much what we're asking you to do is make sure you follow us on Facebook or Instagram via Strong Surge or Behind the News Long Island. Behind the News Long Island, okay?
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
All right. Welcome back to Behind the News Long Island. That is a great song and a great segue. Solidarity Forever by Pete Seeger and the Weaver. And tonight we're talking about workers' rights and the tragedies that have led to organized labor. We're also talking about the deplorable conditions that still exist today, and really when we look at modern day issues that are impacting our communities, the assault on organized labor. And there's no other way to frame it other than really calling it what it is. It was 104 years ago tomorrow, on March 25th, 1911, that the Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory in New York City burned. 145 workers were killed. It's remembered as one of the most infamous incidents in American industrial history. The deaths were largely preventable. The tragedy is something that has brought widespread attention to the dangerous sweatshop conditions of factories and led to the development of a series of laws and regulations to better protect workers' rights. Tonight, I'm joined by two panelists who have dedicated much of their lives to workers' rights and advocating quite fierce for the ability of all human beings to work in safe conditions. And they talk about the right to work being a human right. First, I want to introduce Marianne Trasati, who's an associate professor in the Department of Rhetoric at Hofstra University. She's drawn to the discipline of rhetoric for its power to generate knowledge and create community. Her current scholarly, creative, and activist work is comprised of a book about the free speech of work of labor organizer Elizabeth Gurley Flynn that illuminates how early 20th century radicals created and used public spaces to advocate for economic justice. She's done a lot of work around Superstorm Sandy, and she's also very much involved in the campaign to remember the 146 victims from the Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City, that Triangle Fire. We're also joined by Omar Enriquez. Omar became a national spokesperson on the issue of immigrant safety and health. He's testified in front of numerous congressional hearings on workplace fatalities. Through his extraordinary talent working with the press, he's brought public attention to issues of health and safety for immigrant workers. He's appeared on numerous outlets, and he currently serves as the Eastern organizer for Andalon, which is the National Day Labor Organization Network. He's a great friend and a mentor in my youth, right? So I'm blessed to have both of these panelists here, and please, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. Marianne, I want to get started with you. The Triangle Fires, unless you've taken the time out to do a little bit, something as simple as a Google search, right? And we know that so many individuals are passive learners. They're waiting for something to come up on a Facebook feed nowadays, or, via social media. Unless you're directed to a website, to an article, to do a little bit of research, a lot of folks don't know what the Triangle Fires are. So can you give our listeners a brief history on what the Triangle Fires actually were?
Yeah, sure. Actually, most people don't know very much in the U.S. about labor history. They're just not taught. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire is one of the few things, though, that people do learn, if they learn anything, which often they don't, as I said. It happened in 1911, and the Triangle factory was owned by Max Planck and Isaac Harris, and they employed about 500 people. It was a non-union shop. There was a strike in 1909 in the needle trades, the shirtwaist maker strike, called the Uprising of the 20,000. And it was actually instigated by an incident at the Triangle Fire, and was largely successful in helping to organize workers in New York in the garment industry, except at Triangle. They resisted the union. So it was a non-union shop, although some workers did belong to the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. The employees at Triangle, some of them were as young as 14 years old. Lots of women, some as young as 14 years old. Most of them were immigrant workers, Italians and Jews. And they were poor people living in unfamiliar and often unfriendly, unwelcoming culture. And so they were exploitable, and they were indeed exploited at the Triangle. It's important to note, though, that the factory passed a routine inspection in October of 1910. So people were warning, people like Edward Croker, the fire chief, and others were warning that something was likely to happen because the laws that were in place, the regulations that were in place, were just not adequate. And in fact, something did happen. On March 25th, just before closing time, there was a fire. Apparently, it seems a cigarette that was thrown on the ground lit some cloth, and that spread, and because the machines and the workers were packed so closely together, it spread very, very rapidly. It started on the 8th floor, and workers on the 8th floor were able to go down. It spread soon to the 9th and 10th floor. Workers on the 10th floor went up, and they were carried, many of them, to safety across the roof by NYU law students. The factory is at the corner of Washington and Green in Greenwich Village, in a really nice neighborhood. And there was smoke pouring out all over, and people were dismayed and alarmed by what they were seeing. And the people on the 9th floor were at the greatest disadvantage. They couldn't go up and they couldn't go down. There were no sprinklers. They weren't mandated. There was 27 buckets of water. The doors opened inward, so when the workers on the 9th floor rushed to get out, they actually had to pull the doors inward, and many testified later on that the doors were locked, and they would have been locked to prevent theft, or some people say to prevent union organizers from getting in. And so there was terrible devastation on all 3 floors, but especially on the 9th floor. The fire escape collapsed under the weight of people trying to get out. People piled into the elevator, but ultimately 146 workers were killed. 50 of them actually jumped to their death out the windows rather than be burned to death. They chose to jump, to the horror of New Yorkers who were out on a lovely early spring afternoon in Washington Square. People watched in horror and reported hearing the thud. Some of the girls held hands as they came down. They held their pay envelopes and crashed to the ground. 129 of the 146 were women, and the youngest of the victims was 14 years old. On the older end, maybe 43. There was a woman who was 43, but the youngest was 14. The fire department, Company 72, arrived on the scene, and the ladder only raised up to the 6th floor. There was no mandated taller ladders. So they held out nets and watched again in horror as the girls jumped and broke right through the nets. And people wept. And in fact, there are stories of policemen who, in 1909, that great strike in the garment industry, some of them had actually beaten some of the female strikers. And now as they watched the girls plummet to their death, the cops were standing there in tears. Everyone was weeping. It was truly awful. The bodies were taken to 26th Street Pier for identification, and thousands of New Yorkers were in horror, and some just walked up and down the lines of the temporary morgue looking for something to help them to identify a relative. So it was truly, the fire lasted maybe at most, I think it was declared officially over at 5:15. It started at about 4:40. So it lasted maybe half an hour, and it changed history. It truly was an important 30 minutes.
When you mention that it changed history, clearly this fire had impact, and we talked about how it changed law. Can you tell us what the role of government was before the fire and what it was after that fire? What was because if we now jump to 104 years later, you're describing factories right here in New York City. You're some people say, well, not much has changed, but can you tell us for that small bit of time and even into today, how were we impacted? What was the role before and what was the role right after?
Well, people, we have discussions and debates all the time about what does regulation look like, what does deregulation look like, and I think that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is a great illustration of what in business looks like without regulation. As I said, it passed a mandatory safety inspection. The standards were so minimal that doors, and they have since changed. The New York State Factory Investigating Commission, which was chaired by Governor Al Smith, and Croker was involved, and the Factory Investigating Commission looked into the issue of worker safety and found that there were absolutely minimal and abysmal standards, and mandated things like fire exits, fire extinguishers, maximum occupancy limits, doors opening outward. None of these things existed before. The fire department realized it had to have its ladders higher. In fact, the Fire Prevention Division was created as part of the New York City Fire Department in the aftermath of this fire. So there really was minimal government protection, and New York State actually became a leader in establishing safety standards because of the lessons learned in the Triangle Factory fire. And I have to say, Edward Croker, the New York fire chief, his testimony, which you can see, you can read online at Cornell University's Kiel Center, is really moving. Because he had been warning of such things. And in fact, a lot of people have, and people just weren't listening. These were immigrant workers. No one cared.
As you describe some of these issues and, the way government responded, and you're describing things that a number of us take for granted today, something like emergency exits, making sure that we have, sprinklers that actually work, making sure that, that the ladders will reach up to a certain height, if you will. When you describe those things, none of it is, there are a number of listeners that are probably like, well, that's minimum. But again, that's minimum to us now because we're looking at it from this day and age. But clearly these things would have resulted in, less death, if you will. More survivors would have been able to make it. And, Omar, I want to bring you into the conversation. When I hear Professor Tresciati bring this all up, and when she describes and paints this picture of what transpired then, this is a story that has so much to do with class, right? It has so much to do with the immigrant population, even back then. At the time, it was predominantly Jewish. I believe it was predominantly Jewish immigrants that were dealing with these challenges. That immigrant experience, and most of the individuals that periled were females. Can you tell us who were these workers and how their stories pretty much tie into the plight of workers today?
Yes, thank you, Sergio. I'm happy to be here sharing with you. But I would like, Sergio, just to, before I tell you that, to put something into perspective. Today, at present time, an average of 14 workers die a day. 2 of those workers are Latino every day. And in addition, 50,000 workers die a year as a result of occupational illness. So that brings an average of about 150 workers that are killed every day, that are dying because of illnesses or accidents in the job. So it's kind of ironic to say that almost 150 workers die that created a lot of things from government to protect workers, but still, today, we have 150 workers dying every day as a result of illness or as a result of negligence from employers. And also, I'd just like to say that I'm really proud and honored to be here today because it's also a day that is very dear to a lot of Salvadorans where I'm from, but also for the world. Is the day that our martyr Oscar Arnulfo Romero was assassinated in El Salvador. So it brings a lot. But to go back to your question, immigrants of today immigrants of yesterday are immigrants of today. Immigrants back then were mostly, like you say, Jewish and Italian, but from other regions of the world. Today, the immigrants that we are now today are immigrants from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But we still do the same jobs that immigrants of yesterday were doing. We still are facing, workers are facing sweatshop conditions. And it's funny because when we talk about sweatshop conditions to workers, it's kind of hard to translate sweatshops into Spanish, right? So they say, oh, sudor, perspiring, and they say, it's not sweat. Then I go into tell them why it's called sweatshops. But it is a sweatshop. They sweat a lot. They cry a lot in the places that are, and people would, the conditions that you could describe very well back then, we still have them today. So although there has been changes in some government like compensation came out of the workers were able to get compensation. Now compensation is on the attack. They're trying to reduce the amount of money that workers that get injured in the job will receive. So we're under attack again from you say from employers and capital. You say for against workers, but immigrants of today were immigrants of yesterday. I mean, there were mostly we face that. We have people today that come to the worker centers that are members of Endelon to tell us the stories. I have vividly remember when we did a trip to the Statue of Liberty. We took a lot of immigrants from Long Island to visit the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island. And I was taken aback when one of the ladies said, oh, this is where I work. And I said, well, this is the 1800s. No, this is exactly where I work. She was pointing to the same conditions that were depicted in the pictures in Ellis Island to where she was working in Long Island. So, that will tell you a lot to the comparison of how things have changed. But that's the way it is, and we are organizing and trying. The unions are supportive of changing these conditions as they were. The National Electric Department Union was one of the unions that fought wholeheartedly to change these conditions. There are unions today that are supporting immigrants again to change the conditions that workers face in the United States today.
Marianne, as as Omar, so depicts the reality of what today's worker shares with him and, throughout his travels, and I'm sure you've heard some of these things as well. My question to you is, you started off the segment by saying that people aren't informed as to labor and labor practices, and clearly, can you tell us? Can you inform the listening audience as to why it is that we're not a little bit we don't learn this history? It's not at the forefront in U.S. history classes, and it's something that we just sort of gleam over at a particular point, but we don't dedicate any time to really understanding that solidarity. As a professor at a university, and you've taken such interest in this field, what are your thoughts on that?
I think partly why we don't learn labor history is because we live in a society, in a country that pretends that class doesn't exist. That class is not an issue here. That class struggle is not an issue. And so union organizers and working people who attempt to organize, and that's an important point. I think we talk about the changes that came after Triangle. These were changes that were demanded. These weren't handed to us by a benevolent government. When thousands of people marched silently to remember the Triangle dead, that was the union that organized the march, and it was workers who were marching. So these are things that people had to struggle for and fight for, and those struggles have been erased because we try to pretend that they don't exist. And working people get called out all the time for engaging in class struggle. And of course, corporations engage in class struggle on a daily basis, and we don't call it that. We call it downsizing or outsourcing or trade agreements or whatever it is. But it's class struggle. It just doesn't get labeled as such. I also think, quite frankly, the Cold War had something to do with it too. I mean, we so desperately wanted to minimize the influence of radical labor politics and the importance that we basically wrote them out of the curriculum. And so we're starting, and that's Triangle, I think, is a good way to start rewriting that curriculum, because it's young women and girls, and it's a story that people really can relate to.
Yeah, as we hear about deplorable conditions in the workplace, and we hear, about, even conditions abroad, right? The Triangle Fire has, we've had modern day Triangle Fires in other countries. We're constantly dealing with these different issues. Globalization impacts us, these trade agreements impact, but seldom, if ever, do we come back to our homeland, right? On Long Island, for example, there have been cases where individuals, we don't talk about indentured slaves, yet we know we have them. Women, many of times very young in age, working in homes where they are dropped off by whoever is pimping them, quote unquote, right, in a way, dropping them off, using them as labor, dropping them off in some of the wealthiest and most affluent neighborhoods, and picking these individuals up a month later, not really giving them the wages they deserve, no rights. We don't talk about that here. These are people that work in our when we drop off our dry cleaners. These are the invisible people that bring us water and bread. They work in our kitchens. They work in hotels. They landscape and manicure our lawns and these campuses that we go to school at, these buildings that we work in. Yet we don't talk about the modern day connection. Can you share some of those stories and how they translate? What are the stories that you've heard about these deplorable conditions today, Homer?
Well, it's wage theft is an issue for a lot of workers. And when the sweatshop is defined by the violation of one or two federal or state laws, and there's not one or two laws that are being violated. There's many laws that are violated from workers. But you mentioned that domestic workers, which is an industry in Long Island, where many affluent homes hired or contract domestic laborers. But in response to that, it's worker centers that have organized themselves, and this is a reminiscence of how immigrants in the past organized to change their working conditions. Now they have a domestic workers bill of rights. There's a national organization for domestic workers. Right now in Massachusetts, they're fighting for a domestic bill of rights there. So people are not taking it sitting down. People are fighting and struggling to get what's right, you know. And most of the conditions, especially the people that we represent, which is day laborers, they go to work. They don't never get any training on the equipment they're going to use. They never provided with the personal protective equipment, which is dictated by the OSHA law. They work, you know, sometimes, and again, when people think of sweatshop, a sweatshop is not. It could be a warehouse. It could be a restaurant where you work 16, 18 hours, and you only get paid for 10 hours of work. So to me, that's a sweatshop condition. People that work in homes, you know, 24 hours. They're on call 24 hours. And I've spoken to women, and there's testimony of women that you know, they might be sleeping and they wake up because you have to do something. So there's no regular hours. So the violations of labor's laws are everywhere. But our response is to organize. And right now, you know, we are doing a lot of organizing, first to defend ourselves for most of the workers are undocumented. And, you know, in the past, immigrants sometimes, you know, came undocumented. So it's kind of the same situation. But now, since the criminalization of immigrants, we have to fight against deportations now. Our organization worked hard to stop deportations. This administration deported 2 million workers. So there's also that you throw that into the equation. A worker which is working in terrible conditions, it's not getting paid because you know, the salary is not that they're getting paid, they're just not paid at all. And on top of that, they're being separated from their families because their parent or mother is being deported. So there's a lot of issues that affect workers in terms of struggling for better job conditions.
Marianne, I've worked with a lot of youth throughout my life, throughout my professional career, and I've met 13 and 14-year-olds that can tell me that, you know, that they're doing roofing during the summer, that they do roofing, throughout the year. I've met 15-year-old girls that can tell me that they were living, you know, as a live-in, quote-unquote, maid, or, you know, all these different positions that they hold, where these conditions are still going on today. What's your, you know, what's your connection to that?
We also know too that there are children working in tobacco fields and getting quite sick from that. I mean, child labor still exists in the U.S. Our theme, so tomorrow's the commemoration, and I would love if anyone in the listening audience is available either to live stream or to come to the corner of Washington and Green in the Village tomorrow. From 11:30 until 1, we will be remembering the Triangle Fire. But the theme is We Are All Workers. And we chose that theme and the issues of income inequality, right to organize, fair wages. We chose issues that confronted Triangle workers in 1911 and all workers, and still confront workers today. So unfortunately, we're still dealing with the same issues.
We're right. You know, we're at the halfway mark. When we come back, I want to hear a lot more about what's going on tomorrow, and you know where we are today. We're talking, you know, working in a graveyard 3 miles down by Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson. The song was titled 3 Miles Down. Tonight we are joined by two phenomenal guests. They are my guests out from Long Island today. Marianne Traciati, who's the associate professor at Hofstra University and is very involved on a number of different fronts with workers' rights, and Mr. Omar Enriquez, who's currently the Eastern organizer for Andalon. We've been talking about workers' rights tonight on Behind the News Long Island. I am your host, Sergio Argueta, Serge. We're talking about critical issues impacting our region, and you know, when we're talking about this issue of the Triangle Fires back in 1911 and 104 years later, we're still dealing with some of these same challenges. The question becomes, how does today's policy impact tomorrow? And so, you know, just picking up the conversation, I want to talk trade and globalization and the impact that it's had on the plight of workers throughout the world. While we're talking about the Triangle Fire this evening, there are countless, you know, incidents that have taken place throughout the world And you know, I know Marianne. You know, we've discussed some of these issues briefly. Can you give us just a couple of the major events throughout the last couple of years that we know have proven just as detrimental as the Triangle fires?
Well, yeah, probably the most tragic that happened recently was in Bangladesh on April 24th. 1,120, I think 29 people died when a factory collapsed, and approximately 2,000 were injured. And like at the Triangle Fire, there were all indications that this was an unsafe place to work, and that the generators that would turn on would rattle the building so much that it would cause the structural foundation to be compromised. And in fact, it collapsed. And those workers in Bangladesh, Kalpana Akhtar in particular, who's one of the leading organizers of garment workers in Bangladesh, they actually are inspired by the story of Triangle. And in fact, for the centennial of the Triangle Fire, Kalpana Akhtar came to the U.S. and marched with us and spoke with us. And in fact, every year, this year we have a Salvadoran organizer coming. Last year we had this dynamite Haitian organizer. We've got taxi workers, Fight for 15 workers come. The theme, as I said, is we are all workers. And the Bangladeshi organizers, there have been organizers who've come to speak, to testify at the UN, who have made a pilgrimage to the Triangle factory site. Because this is the place where the line in the sand was drawn in the U.S., where people really pushed back, and leading that struggle were immigrant workers and their unions. And they are inspired by the story today. So we tend to think we don't need unions in the U.S. anymore because all the problems have been solved. But as my partner here has demonstrated, they have not been solved. And indeed, those that we no longer confront directly, we have merely exported. So we've either hidden them or exported them to places like Bangladesh. And Triangle reminds us that we can't forget about these things.
And clearly, we all have a role in this throughout the world, and it's important for us, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But you know, Omar, when we talk about organized labor, oftentimes the issue is framed in such a way that it juxtaposes the worker with the price of a product that they're producing, and eventually who's going to purchase that product. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's the layman is often told that, oh, if we allow these individuals to unionize, then you know you're not going to be able to afford these products, and you know it puts you know the laborer against the individual buying this product, which oftentimes comes from the same community.
Wow.
And you know, so part of it is, you know, how do we explain to the common folk why organized labor is so important?
Well, before that, you know, it's saying divide and conquer, right? If you have a divided labor force, it will be harder to unionize. If you pit against one worker against another one, it will be harder to unionize. But to the question of, because I always say, we are workers that happen to be immigrants. But we workers, most of all, we provide a lot of needed capital for the country. I mean, we harvest the food that people enjoy. You know, like you said, we provide essential services for the economic well-being of this nation. Now, in terms of organizing, I remember when I did my was testifying in the Senate. We call us. I said that we were considered disposable workers, because that's how we're seen now in the term. Because they said, well, you know, there's no value to our lives, to our work, yes, and it's like kind of the mind workers. Yeah, we need you, but we need your labor, not you. Once you became sick or injured, we'll replace you, because there's no value for the human life of workers. There's no value. I mean, even today, and the rate of injuries and illnesses and people getting killed at the job demonstrates that. But in terms of unions, I mean, if labor history is not taught in the United States, they will not learn. They don't know that, you know, for instance, I was talking to Marianne here during the break, that Americans do not know that May 1st, which the world celebrates collectively on May 1st, the United States doesn't. And it began here and in Chicago, in the Haymark struggles. And so this association of the history of labor, of the struggle of labor with the United States. When I do trainings for labor rights, it's like young people here in America, they don't know, the similarity with immigrants is so striking, because immigrants sometimes, they don't know their rights. Young people here in America don't know their rights about labor rights. They don't know OSHA. They don't know minimum wage, and they're eager to please their bosses. So there's similarities. But in terms of organizing, again, union members became too complacent of what they have. They became middle class. They forgot that they were and they are the working class. I always hear about, this the comedy about, oh, we have to help the middle class in America. What about the working class? I mean, the working class is the one that is struggling the most. It's not the middle class. It's a myth. Now, the middle class was obtained and it was gotten because of the unions. The unions were able to raise the wages of these workers so they can send the children to better to school, to college. But that's gone. Now, today, we are making connections with the unions. Unions have, because the union density is going the lowest it has ever been. So there's a need for us to come together because I believe, and a lot of people, not just me, that immigrants again will not create the union movement of the past, but we will revitalize the union movement, and we will be able to bring the social struggle, labor struggle, to the front.
Marianne, we while Omar's making the connection to the immigrant struggle, I want you to talk about the movements going on, because this isn't just the immigrant population. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm a member of the New York State Union Teachers Association here in New York State. There's an assault on New York State teachers, teachers throughout the nation that have fought hard for their rights and what benefits they've earned. But we know that fast food workers are organizing. We know that on a number of different fronts they're coming together for a number of different reasons. Can you tie in what Omar is saying to this question?
Well, and just to get back to the issue of devaluing labor but devaluing people. On March 11th, 1914, Max Planck and Isaac Harris, who owned the Triangle Fire, who were themselves Jewish. So this was 2/3 of the victims were members of their own community.
Back home.
Yeah.
Back home.
Yeah.
Right?
So here's where class interest trumped
Yes.
bonds of ethnicity or religion. They settled for $75 per life lost. They had insured the equipment in the factory such that they actually made more money on what they were paid in the insurance of their property than they paid in terms of the lives lost.
So just to be clear, they profited.
They made
from
money.
the death of these folks.
They actually they got more in insurance for the equipment they lost than they paid out for each of the lives that were lost. $75 per life. And some of these families were devastated. Families lost. There's one family, the Maltese family, lost the mother and 2 daughters. All the women were gone. Sisters, Rosie and Katie Weiner, gone. Israel Rosen, 17 years old, and his mother Julia, gone. And so $75 a person. So the lives don't matter. It's the labor that matters. And I think that's why we call our organization, Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, because we recognize that we need everyone. We need immigrants' rights activists. We need jobs with justice activists. We need the Fight for 15. We need the Bangladesh organizers. We need academics. We need artists. We need everyone. And solidarity has always been the cornerstone of the labor movement. And there's a reason for that, because it's only through unity that we can accomplish anything. Lacking as we do, financial resources, control of government, we need solidarity. And so I think that one of the positive signs in the labor movement is there are these coalitions being built. There is a coming together. May Day is becoming a day for celebrating immigrant rights, championing immigrant rights, but labor is coming back. I mean, the AFL, the New York City Central Labor Council, we're planning, and the coalition, we're planning activities for May Day. We will be marching in the streets for May Day. So we have to do this together.
Establishing common ground, right? We are all workers.
We are.
All human beings deserve the right to be able to feed a family. And when we talk about those hard-fought rights, when we talk about the 40-hour work week, when we talk about just the quality of life, we talk, oftentimes we say we're the best country in the world. Based on what measure, right? Certainly not the way we treat our poor, not the way we treat our elderly, not the way we provide for our youth, and certainly not the way we treat the worker. the individual that made this country great. And when we talk about how all of this is dissipated throughout the years and this lack in the way they frame the issue. So, you know, I mean, let's talk about these various states that are coming up with these catchy phrases like a right to work, right? Like a right to work. That's something, that's an attack on workers today. Can we talk about that and how they're trying to chisel away, and who's funding that work? Who's funding that type of project, Marion?
Yeah, right to work. The language of right
The
to work
language.
is really interesting because it, you know, it's framed in language that's very appealing in the U.S. I mean, this is the language of rights is very important, but rights are usually individualized, right? I mean, and so my right to free speech, my right to assemble, my right to believe the way that I wish, and that the individuals matter. But what right to work laws assume that when I go into a negotiation with a prospective employer or a current employer, that I and my employer have the same, we're equal players in this field. And we know, in fact, that that's not the case. You know, I am very often treated as an expendable, I being the worker, an expendable resource, as we were just talking about. And so that language, I think, masks a really insidious effort that has succeeded in a lot of places. I mean, the South is a bastion of right to work. Now, alas, my favorite state, Wisconsin, right to work. And it really hides an unequal playing field, an unequal power relationship between workers and employers who hold most of the resources and control, and so that's really dangerous.
And I guess because, you know, the right to work is much more catchier than the right to enslave or the right to make poor or the right to make sure that you can't provide for your family, which is the situation that we currently find ourselves in. Omar, when we talk about NAFTA and CAFTA and these other trade agreements that are ravaging, right?
I'd free track right now.
Free track on the speed track, right?
Speed track.
Right.
Fast track,
Where
fast track, I
where
mean.
these individuals have created these trade agreements. And, you know, one of the things that I like to do is I try and find that, you know, establishing that common ground. I'm thinking about someone who grew up on Long Island, right? And they live in a community where they worked really hard, and back then those blue-collar jobs that were unionized labor positions existed, and these individuals were able to purchase a home and purchase a vehicle and took their family on vacation, and life was quite different, and they don't make the connection to unionized labor. Then, as a result of these trade agreements, these corporations now set up shop in Mexico and throughout Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, you know, and continue traveling, right? Now, these folks that are further impoverished as a result of these trade agreements, they leave as a result not only of war, right? Not only, but this man-made poverty that pushes and pulls this immigrant population, and now they get this quote-unquote influx of immigrants in their suburban dream, and now they've lost that job. Now they don't have that security, and it literally pits the immigrant versus that blue-collar worker that is literally seeing his American dream fade away, and now the xenophobe is jumping in and saying, you've lost everything because of them. And it puts one against the other. Omar, how do we combat that? How do we paint the picture? What is it why are we failing at educating the individual that's a poor white person on Long Island, or linking them to the poor African American, to the poor Latino, the poor Asian? This is a class struggle.
Well, I have this many factors, but I think that they've been led to believe that they are better than everyone else, that they're superior than everyone else, that they have certain privilege which they don't have. They banish. For us, it's not an American dream; it's an American nightmare. The nightmare that we live when we come to the States, even if you are not, the independent of your immigration status. But you mentioned free trade. I say free trade, fast track right now. I remember the arguments and the facts that we were presenting, that they are being presented now for fast track. That the effects of if that passes is going to have. We did have it in CAFTA. And NAFTA, we did present the arguments of what was going to happen, and one of the things I would say was going to happen was that was going to increase immigration. Migration, people were going to migrate to the United States. If you're going to disseminate the livelihood of millions of people that depend on agriculture, when the subsidized agricultural products of the United States were introduced into Mexico and Central America, it disseminated the whole the agricultural sector of Mexico and Central America, and there was no recourse for them to do. So what are they going to do? They're going to move to the United States. So we connect the trade agreements to migration. And there's also, when we talk about immigration, there's three things that make you migrate: social, economic conditions, political conditions, and persecution. Right? In the case of Central America, in the 80s, it was the war that Reagan supported. I mean, he was pumping $1 million a day into El Salvador to support a regime that killed Monsignor Romero. So people, what did they do? They came to the United States. So there's a direct link to migration to the trade agreements. And right now, the best example would be fast track. And people are arguing against that, and they're saying this is what's going to happen. And I recall that that's the same arguments we're doing when CAFTA and NAFTA were being argued.
Omar, you're making references to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And when we talk about, for example, the impact that it's had, and let's be clear, there are more migrants coming post-Civil War from Central America as a result of the economic violence imposed on these countries through these trade agreements. And, when we talk about globalization, this is that silent killer, right? These gangsters, went in there, destabilized governments, and now, even in terms of negotiating trade agreements, it's not even a country that holds the negotiating power. It's these corporations, right? And so, that's how I want to loop this back to what is happening tomorrow. How do we get people out there tomorrow? What are you guys doing? What's the Triangle Fire commemoration? And if there's someone who's listening right now, what are you saying to them to get them to this event? Because we need them there tomorrow.
Yeah, we need people there tomorrow, and we need people every day, right? So tomorrow, we're at the corner of Washington and Green between 11:30 and 1. Please come out. We'll have, again, organizers from, we bring organizers from around the world. We bring organizers from different industries. We bring the head of the New York City Central Labor Council. And then we fire up, we fire up, we talk about the struggles that still confront workers today. And then we raise the ladder to the 6th floor. We call out the names of the Triangle victims. We call out the names of Bangladeshi workers who die. We call out the names of workers who've been killed in workplace accidents. Not just here in New York, not just in 1911, but other times, other places. And then actually after tomorrow, we are going over to the Children's Place. There's an action at the Children's Place, trying to pressure the Children's Place to sign the accord for Bangladeshi, the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh. That's a legally binding accord that was drawn up by organizations, individuals who are really concerned with the way, the working conditions of people who make the clothing that we wear every day. So I think it's important to note that one part of the struggle that still remains from Triangle is the struggle to organize, the struggle to build solidarity. It's also, the things we buy. Where do you get your clothes? What do the labels on your clothes say? Do you go to the Children's Place? Do you go to the Gap? Or have they signed the accord? It's who we associate with, it's who we struggle with, it's what we buy, it's how we live.
That's a perfect segue into our clothes. Pretty much everything we do has an impact. It's a ripple effect, and we need to be extremely conscious of it. You've been listening to WBAI's Behind the News Long Island. We do have guests in the studio today. We have Mr. Fraser Otonelli, professor of history from the University of South Florida, that is down in New York today for this commemoration. He'll be in the building tomorrow. Antonio Kelly, who's taking pictures and video of tonight's program, and we're putting it up on YouTube. So please make sure you go on WBAI's website. We'll have links to that. And of course, Reggie Johnson, always holding us down, making us sound like we know what we're doing. And I definitely want to give a birthday shout out to Brother P. Swayze, who actually is the one who you hear at the beginning of every Behind the News Long Island episode with our theme song. Pretty much none of us can survive without each other, right? And so tomorrow, make sure you
We're all
come out and you
connected.
support this endeavor. One thing that I'm going to tell you, we close out the way we always do. One mic, one voice, one community. It's not your community, it's not my community, it's ours. And if we don't take care of it, who will? Peace.
Check. Hey yo, it's time. Hey yo, it's time. It's time. Hey yo, it's time. We interrupt your programming and bring it to you live from the front lines. Strong animated gangs fleeing one time. Police is brutal like the streets is. Let my speech increase the peace through your speakers. Beat our weakness, of course, is division. Caused by religion, race, poor, be in prison way more than the rich ones. The laws of the pawns for position. My flow expose flaws in the system. Look, you can't afford to be a bystander. Behind the news where the lies die, we strive for high standards. The real power's in the hands of the people. Politics, propaganda, it's all see-through. And that's word that serves. The time is now. For the youth in our roots, gotta stand our ground. Listen Tuesdays at 5. Tune in to 99.5 East Ways. Reporting live behind the news. Radio will break from the norm as we advocate for change and reform. Behind the news, unifying while exposing the counterfeits. It's the new voice of empowerment. Behind the new platform for the people it serves, where the truth in your speakers emerge. Behind the new, where politics meet their limitations, you get the real, never imitation. Behind the news, it's time, sweet. It's time, it's time.